Hey guys, welcome back to Better Health, Better Work. In this video, we're going to make it a quick one. We're going to go over how more exercise leads to a better brain. Now, everyone knows that exercise is good for you, but the question is, why is it good for you? In this video, we're going to attempt to go over that. We're going to break this video up into two main parts. In the first part, we're largely going to go over changes in behavior. So how do people change their behavior once they start exercising? Are we able to see things from the outside, like changes in cognition, attention, mood, etc., etc.? Then in the second half of this video, we're going to be looking at the internal changes that we see along the lines of the kind of biological changes that we see in the brain, like changes in gray matter volume, maybe stuff like that. We will be looking at some changes in the brain in the first part of the video, but a lot of that will be saved for the second half of the video. So to start things off with, let's look at one correlational study that found that, I quote, "Those who more frequently engaged in strength exercise had significantly higher GPA," end quote. This is a pretty cool study, and while it is very much so fully correlational, and there are likely lots of other things other than exercise that are causing this increase in GPA, it still is a cool result to look at. We can see that in younger populations, exercise might have some kind of cognitive benefit. In the second study that we're going to be looking at, gray matter volumes, a correlational study that looks at adults, around 300 of them around the age of 78. What they did was they took brain scans of these people at the beginning of the study, and then 9 years later looked at their brains again, and they found that greater physical activity was associated with greater gray matter volume in certain regions of the brain. These regions of the brain are, I quote, "frontal, occipital, entorhinal, and the hippocampal region," end quote. So this is a pretty cool kind of result we like to see, and an interesting nuance in this study was that when these participants walked up to 72 blocks, the greater and greater walking that they did, the more changes they saw in their brain. However, past 72 blocks, there wasn't really that much of a change. That's kind of a cool little finding. We see a diminishing curve kind of result from levels of physical activity and changes in gray matter volume. So these next two studies looked at people in the workplace, workers, and how they kind of had differences in workplace productivity when physical activity was introduced. This first study found that, I quote, "versus an active comparison condition, a sit less, move more workplace intervention effectively reduced an array of markers of lost workday productivity," end quote. So this study is really cool because it is a causational study, and they did use a pretty high sample size across 6 different universities. And again, it's really nice because it measures productivity directly. So we can see that productivity is directly improved by physical exercise, at least, keeping in mind the limitations of the study and things they might have not controlled for. Another study found that higher levels of physical activity were related to higher levels of mental well-being, which is a really cool result for us because, as we covered in the meditation video, we know that when you have improved mental well-being, you're going to be more productive. And again, to summarize the research here, I won't go in depth into it like I did in the meditation video, but a quick summary is that, I quote, "lower happiness is systematically associated with lower productivity," end quote. And then two, studies looking at nurses and looking at real estate agents, and then another study that was kind of a meta-analysis. They found that the more stressed people are, the worse they do at their jobs. And while these might seem largely correlational, these two other studies found that when you improve people's psychological well-being, their job performance goes up, indicating a more unidirectional causation rather than a bidirectional causation. What that means is that if you are stressed, that's likely what's impacting your job performance, not the fact that you're doing bad at your job, which is making you more stressed. While worse job performance might be making you more stressed, it largely seems that the lower mental well-being is causing the decline in job performance over the fact that a lower job performance is causing a lower mental well-being. And again, 2 more studies that kind of found, again, this association between exercise and lower levels of stress have really cool results. I quote, "Workday exercise can improve white-collar workers' mood and self-reported performance on days when they exercise at work over days when they do not," end quote. So while their performance, since it's self-reported, isn't very reliable, they do have better mood, which is great. And again, what we just kind of went over, better mood means more productivity. So they were probably right in assessing that they did more on the days that they exercised if they were indeed feeling better. And another study found that, I quote, "exercise can improve self-esteem," end quote. And while at first self-esteem might kind of seem unrelated to productivity, it is very, very closely tied to productivity. Again, because of that tie between mental well-being and levels of stress and job performance, because an improved self-esteem leads to lower levels of stress. This one study found that, I quote, self-esteem affected stress, and it was affected from stress. This interaction takes place in different levels, including personal, psychological, and professional parameters, end quote. So improved self-esteem will lead to lower levels of stress, which is great for us because, again, we know lower levels of stress lead to improved productivity. Now we'll dive into a couple more studies, and then we'll start getting into the kind of brain changes and stuff like that, the real kind of juicy, interesting parts of this video. So the first one, in Denmark, they found that 15 randomized controlled trials with over 3,500 workers. This was a really comprehensive study with a lot of data, and this study had really cool results. They found that, I quote, productivity increased with improved muscle strength and decreased body mass index, end quote. So this is a really cool finding. Now, while we don't know exactly what mechanisms are at play here, if there are changes in the brain, or again, possibly just changes in self-esteem, because when you see the results from working out, you might be slimmer, you might be a little more muscular. That does kind of contribute to your sense of self-esteem a little bit. So that might be what's causing it. But again, nonetheless, it does show that exercise does improve markers of productivity, which is great. Another study found a really cool finding. It found that during walking and right after walking, your creativity is boosted. This might explain why some artists, some writers, some painters, stuff like that, they'll kind of get up and pace around the room when they don't know what to do. Another study found that 94 participants who performed 30 minutes of aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, or non-exercise separated by 7 days each in a randomized crossover design were able to, see significant improvements in their cognition. And this was in an untrained high school youth population. So again, another study looking at younger people, which is good for us because it means that it can apply to a wide range of people in all different age groups. Since a lot of these studies largely look at older people, it is nice to have more studies that also look at younger people so we can see that the effects of exercise do apply to both populations, not just one over the other. And then another study, the last one that we're going to be looking at that looks largely at behavior, found that, I quote, aerobic exercise training is associated with modest improvements in attention, processing speed, executive function, and memory, although the effects of exercise on working memory are less consistent, end quote. This is another really cool result. We can see really direct increases in cognitive performance. And in this next section, we're gonna see why some of those changes might be happening. All right, so time for part 2 of this video, where we're gonna be looking at the changes in the brain more in depth. So the first study that I want to kind of start with is this meta-analysis that looked at how exercise impacted the brain. It found that, I quote, exercise-induced improvements in cognitive function are correlated with neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity, and neurotrophins in the hippocampus, end quote. And as we'll see in the upcoming research, the neurotrophins in the hippocampus are a really big focus of a lot of the research and do suggest why we see the improvements that we see. So in this next one, we're going to be looking at how, the hippocampus was affected specifically. And this is a really cool study because it had extremely significant results. So for some background on this study, I'm going to quote the beginning of it. I quote, the hippocampus shrinks in late adulthood, leading to impaired memory and increased risk for dementia. Hippocampal and medial temporal lobe volumes are larger in higher fit adults, and physical activity training increases hippocampal perfusion, but the extent to which aerobic exercise training can modify hippocampal volume in late adulthood remains unknown, end quote. So this study basically kind of starts off with hey, we know that the hippocampus declines as we get older, and we want to see if exercise can reverse or maybe prevent this hippocampal decline. And what they found was, yes, it definitely can. So I'll pop up the graphs for the hippocampus on screen, and as you can see, I quote, exercise training increased hippocampal volume by 2%, effectively reversing age-related brain loss in volume by 1 to 2 years, end quote. So this is really cool, and if you want to kind of think about why this might be happening, they talk about how, I quote, we also demonstrate that increased hippocampal volume is associated with greater serum levels of BDNF, a mediator of neurogenesis in the innate gyros, end quote. So while you can see on the kind of graphs that people who did exercise saw an increase in that hippocampal volume, people who didn't exercise saw the expected decline. So there is a pretty big difference between those who did exercise and those who didn't. And another kind of important thing that I just mentioned is the increase in BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this brain-derived neurotrophic factor is the main thing that some of the other studies are going to be looking at. This one study in particular that looked at rats. But we're going to get into the rat study closer to the end after we look at some of the other research also, concerning the dentate gyros and the hippocampus and brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So this next study had a pretty small sample size, but they did find some pretty cool results that kind of corroborate the results that we saw in the last study, with an increase in the dentate gyros of the hippocampus. And they found that, I quote, exercise differentially targets the dentate gyros, a hippocampal subregion important for memory and implicated in cognitive aging, end quote. So again, we can see that the dentate gyros, again, that decline as we age more and more, and that are implicated in the cognitive declines that we see in later age, are improved when we exercise, which is great because it can act as a preventative measure for when we get older, and it can also act as kind of a boost when we're younger and we haven't seen that decline yet. And so the question is, what are the dentate gyros actually responsible for? So they're responsible for memory related processes, so we can remember more when our dentate gyros are better. And this area of the brain is really special because, I quote, in most brain regions the generation of neurons is generally confined to a discrete developmental period. Exceptions are found in the dentate gyros and the subventricular zone of several species that have been shown to generate new neurons well into the postnatal and adult period, end quote. So they're one of the few brain regions that can have, continued neurogenesis later in life, or at least are one of the regions that are more susceptible to it, which is really cool. And again, since it declines when we age, it's cool to have this kind of mechanism to keep it from not declining and to keep it improving. And when we look at more and more studies, we can see that the hippocampus and the dentate gyros are specifically targeted by exercise for some reason. So why do we see this change in the hippocampus and in the dentate gyros specifically? Well, one study found that, I quote, physical exercise can increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor gene expression in specific brain regions, end quote. And these specific brain regions, of course, are the hippocampus and the dentate gyros. So what is brain-derived neurotrophic factor? Well, it is, I quote, a key molecule involved in plastic changes relating to learning and memory, end quote. So what exactly are neurotrophins? They are, I quote, factors that have an important role in neural regeneration, remyelination, and regulating the development of peripheral and central nervous systems by intracellular signaling through specific receptors, end quote. What this basically means is that the more brain-derived neurotrophic factor we have present in certain areas of the brain, the better those areas are going to perform. Very, very simplistic definition that glosses over a lot of things, but the way we kind of want to look at it is that brain-derived neurotrophic factor basically increases neurogenesis, which means that when we exercise and we produce more of this BDNF in our hippocampus and in our dentate gyros, we see those areas of the region kind of grow, or we see them have more neurons in that area, and they're able to increase their sizes much more easily. It kind of acts like steroids for that part of our brain in terms of the neurogenesis, which is, how much our brains are going to grow. And again, another study that found an increase in hippocampal volume looked at older women with probable MCI, and they found that, I quote, aerobic training significantly increased hippocampal volume in older women with probable MCI, end quote. So another really cool study, and again, it kind of shows that exercise acts as a preventative measure as well as kind of an increase right now. So in the moment, we'll see cognitive benefits, but later on in life, we won't experience cognitive decline as well. And the last kind of main study that we're going to be looking at looked at this brain-derived neurotrophic factor and decided to see if that indeed was what was causing the benefits in cognition seen by exercise. What they did was they inhibited BDNF activity in some rats, and what they found was that when they did this, I quote, by inhibiting BDNF action, we block the benefit of exercise on cognitive function, such that the learning and recall abilities of exercise animals receiving the BDNF blocker were reduced to sedentary control levels, end quote. So this is a rat study, but it's a really, really cool study because it tells us the exact mechanism through which exercise is bringing about a lot of its changes. It seems that the increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the dentate gyros and the hippocampus seem to be driving a lot of the main cognitive benefits that we get from exercise. So overall, to kind of sum up the second part of the video, we found that exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the hippocampus and in the dentate gyros, and this increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor is largely what might be driving most of the cognitive benefits that we see from exercise. While it isn't fair to kind of completely 100% conclude this does seem to be one of the main mechanisms at the very least that seems to be driving cognitive improvements that we see from exercise. So overall, we know now that exercise exercise does indeed improve mood, improve cognition, improve learning, and improve memory, and we know the mechanisms through which exercise does this. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor increases in the hippocampus and the dentate gyros. So not only does exercise act as a boost right now, but it also acts as a preventative measure. What this means is that as we get older and older, we see cognitive decline, but if we exercise, we won't see that same cognitive decline. That kind of wraps it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something. Have a good day.